Hello and welcome to this very short presentation on helping you to understand attachment challenges and how they show up. So first of all, we need to speak about a gentleman by the name of John Bowlby. And over 3 decades, through the 1960s, 70s and 1980s, he began to do research. And in particular, he began to do research on the mental health of London's homeless children. And he developed what we called in the past attachment theory, but that we now call attachment science. And he suggested that there were 3 questions that infants and children needed to hear yes, yes, and yes to in order for them to feel safe, secure, and willing to explore the world and be social. And the questions were this: is my primary caregiver nearby? Is my primary caregiver accessible? And is my primary caregiver attentive? And what I mean by them needing to hear the answer yes to these questions isn't that the infants asked the questions, but in terms of how they were held, how they were treated, how they were loved. Well, then they needed to know that their primary caregiver was nearby, was accessible and attentive whenever they needed support, whenever they needed to be held, whenever they needed to be fed, whenever they needed to be kept warm, whenever they needed to be soothed. Now, more recently, Dr. Sue Johnson, who is the author of so many amazing books on attachment theory and on the whole science of love, she said that as adults, we ask the very same questions of our partners and of the people we love. And these questions are what we call our questions, A or E. So A, are you available when I need you? Or are you responsive to my needs? And E, are you emotionally engaged in me? Now, let's go back to the infants. And I use the word infant because much of this stuff happened in the pre-verbal stage of childhood. Now, if an infant perceives the answer to be yes, yes, and yes, then the infant will feel loved, safe, and secure, and feels free to explore the world and to be sociable. But if the infant perceives that the answer to be no to even just one of the questions, then the infant experiences anxiety, which activates what we call attachment-seeking behaviours. And these can range from proximity seeking, visually monitoring, clinging, searching, to intense protesting and vocal signalling or crying. And this was discovered through the work of Bowlby back in 1969. Now, the attachment-seeking system deactivates in children and in infants when one of these three things happen. And listen carefully. When the child establishes proximity and contact with their primary caregiver, when they receive comfort and support from their caregiver, or lastly, when the child wears down. And that's important. This attachment-seeking system deactivates when the child gets that proximity and that contact from their caregiver, when they receive comfort and security from their caregiver, or thirdly, and very importantly, when the child wears down. And this instantly begins to point to the fact that there are very big differences in how children learn to react and respond to the availability and the responsiveness and the emotional availability of their caregivers and the different threats and stresses that they experienced. Now, in order to understand the differences, Bowlby and a colleague of his by the name of Mary Ainsworth began studying and observing the interactions between an infant and their primary attachment figure, which in this case usually was their mum. Now, Mary Ainsworth developed a protocol which was called the Strange Situation Procedure. And this involved separating the infants from their mothers for short periods of time and then reuniting them in order to observe and understand the differences in infants' reactions and behaviours to separation and reunions with their primary attachment figures. And so Mary Ainsworth identified and labelled differences in attachment behaviours into 3 psychological constructs called attachment styles. So first of all, she observed that those infants grouped as what we would call with a secure attachment style, they were happy and explorative when their parent was present. But when their parent was absent, they became distressed and they reduced the play that they were doing. But when they were reunited with their parent, they were easily soothed and they were able to explore and engage in play again. Now, Ainsworth emphasised that the secure attachment style was heavily influenced by consistent, supportive interactions and responsiveness. And from this consistency, these children were able to develop what we would call a knowing or a perception about attachment. And this is what they subconsciously learned, that they could rely on others for comfort, reassurance and protection, that it feels good, that they feel protected, that they feel safe, and that they have that freedom to get out there into the world and to explore. But they also had perceptions and knowings, not just about others and how others related to them in terms of attachment, but also knowings about themselves. And this is subconscious, that they were worthy of love, support and attention. Now, for those that were labelled anxious or ambivalent, well, it was observed that during the mother's presence, that these children were overly attentive and clingy. And during separation, they showed signs of intense anxiety, distress, and their play became restricted. Now, when they were reunited with their parent, the funny thing is they were not easily soothed. Their play continued to be restricted and they were unable to explore any further. Now, Ainsworth emphasised that the attachment style that we now know as anxious and ambivalent was heavily influenced by inconsistent interactions and responsiveness from their primary caregiver. So what did these children learn? Well, these children began to learn, and these learnings again were subconscious perceptions and knowings that others won't always be there in times of need. And this prevents them from feeling safe and exploring. And the knowings or perceptions that are unconscious about themselves is that they are unworthy of love, support and attention. And finally, those grouped with what we would call having an avoidant attachment style, well, when their mothers were present, Ainsworth began to notice that these infants did avoid contact and they didn't share their toys or they didn't share their play. So even with their parent present, they avoided contact, specifically eye contact and proximity. When their parent was absent, they showed little outward signs of distress or anxiety. And the word that's important here is that they showed little outward signs of distress or anxiety. That's not to say that they didn't feel it or experience it, is that there was very little outward display of distress or anxiety. When they were reunited with their parent, They continued to avoid contact. Their focus, their attention on their toys rather than on their parent. And again, Ainsworth really wanted to highlight that the avoidant attachment style was heavily influenced by continued neglectful or rejecting interactions. So at the top here for secure, we have consistent supportive, whereas for avoidant, we have continued neglectful and rejecting interactions. So what were the subconscious knowings or perceptions that the avoidant infants learned about others? Well, they learned on what we call the implicit level, that others won't be there in the time of need, that they have to explore and find their own way to stay safe. And the implicit knowings and perceptions about themselves, and the word implicit, think of it just meaning the same as subconscious, is that they are unworthy of love, support, and attention. So up here in the top line, you have the secure form of attachment, and below it, you have two forms of insecure attachment. We have the anxious, ambivalent, and we have the avoidant attachment style. And over here in the corner, you'll see IWM. So IWM stands for internal working model. And this is when those repeated interactions are internalized. That's when the infant develops what we call the internal working model of both themselves and of others. So this is the IWM of the self. And this is the IWM really about attachment and about others. And it's important to know that attachment and the inner working model, although they are somewhat stable, they are not set in stone. So exposure to positive, secure attachment figures, exposure to positive romantic, social, professional, and therapeutic relationships, and positive life-changing experiences that happen as we move through adolescence into adulthood can see our attachment style and our inner working model revised and updated.